There are moments, aren't there, when life hinges on a breath, a glance, a single unexpected turn? I think about that now, perched on the edge of this worn armchair, the city lights bleeding through the window like scattered jewels. It's a familiar view, one I've stared at countless times, but tonight it's just a backdrop for the reel playing ceaselessly in my mind. Every flicker, every shadow, every aching memory leads back to him, to the genesis of everything that now feels both sacred and irrevocably broken. Reese. Even his name is a sigh, a secret whispered to the wind. It began, as these monumental shifts often do, in the most unassuming of places. Not a grand ball, not a dramatic rescue, but in the quiet, dusty haven of the written word, my sanctuary, my escape. I remember the chill of early autumn clinging to the air outside, the scent of damp leaves and impending rain. Inside, it was a warm embrace of old paper, coffee, and hushed reverence. I was tucked away in my usual corner, a stack of poetry balanced precariously on my lap, lost in the delicate dance of words. I craved that solitude, that quiet communion with other souls through their verses. My world was small then, meticulously curated to shield me from the jarring notes of the unexpected. Until he walked in. I didn't look up immediately. My eyes were fixed on a line by Mary Oliver, something about the wild and precious life. But a shift in the air, a subtle disturbance in the bookstore's ancient hum, drew my attention. He moved with a quiet power, a fluidity that felt almost out of place amidst the static bookshelves. Tall, with a lean grace that spoke of contained energy, his dark hair a little too long, falling just so over eyes that, when he finally turned, seemed to hold all the melancholic beauty of a storm-swept sea. They were an impossible shade of blue, deep and unsettling, framed by lashes that felt unfairly long on a man. He didn't see me at first. He was browsing the philosophy section, his long fingers tracing the spines of worn books. I watched him, hidden behind a towering display of fiction, a strange, breathless stillness settling over me. It wasn't just his physical presence, though that was undeniable, a raw, magnetic force. It was something else, an invisible current that hummed between us, a resonance I felt deep in my bones, a recognition of a kindred spirit, even before our eyes met. My heart, usually a steady, predictable rhythm, began to thump with a frantic, unfamiliar beat. It was a premonition, I realize now, a tiny tremor before the earthquake. Then he looked up. His gaze swept across the room, unhurried, until it snagged on me. And in that instant, the world tilted. It wasn't just a casual glance. It was an absorption, a deep, penetrating look that felt as though he wasn't just seeing my face, but peering into the very core of my being. All my carefully constructed walls, my quiet solitude, crumbled under the weight of his attention. I felt utterly exposed, yet strangely, gloriously seen. A blush crept up my neck, hot and insistent, betraying my carefully cultivated composure. I wanted to look away, to break the spell, but I couldn't. His eyes held mine, an unspoken conversation passing between us that felt more profound than any words could convey. It was a spark, yes, but it felt more like an ignition, a sudden, searing blaze that promised to consume everything. I learned his routines without asking, anticipated his presence, felt his approach before he even stepped into view. He, I suspected, did the same. When he finally spoke, it was over the worn spine of a first edition of Rilke. "You like him too?" His voice was a low murmur, rich and warm, a sound that resonated directly with the tremor in my chest. It was even more captivating than I'd imagined. "More than like," I confessed, the words tumbling out, unbidden. "He understands the ache." He paused, his eyes, those impossibly blue eyes, searching mine. The ache, he repeated, a quiet agreement. That's precisely it. And in that shared understanding of a poet's melancholy, our worlds truly collided. We talked for hours that day, standing between the towering shelves, the scent of old paper and new coffee swirling around us. We spoke of books, of art, of the hidden currents that run beneath the surface of life, the things people rarely acknowledge aloud. I found myself confessing thoughts and feelings I hadn't even consciously realized I possessed, let alone shared with another living soul. He listened, truly listened, his gaze unwavering, making me feel as though every word I uttered was precious, significant. He had a way of looking at me that made me feel entirely transparent, yet completely cherished. It was exhilarating, terrifying. He told me he was a photographer, that he had recently moved to the city, drawn by its vibrant, if sometimes gritty, beauty. He spoke of capturing fleeting moments, of finding light and shadow. I told him I wrote, not professionally, but as a way to untangle the knotted threads of my own heart. We found common ground in the quiet observation of the world, in the pursuit of beauty, in the understanding that some things are felt more deeply than they can ever be expressed. I remember the first time he touched me. We were leaving the bookstore, the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows across the street. A small gust of wind caught my scarf, threatening to send it dancing into the street. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my wrist as he steadied it. It was a fleeting contact, barely there, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through me, a warmth that spread through my veins. His touch felt different, not just a physical sensation, but an affirmation, a promise. His skin was warm, his grip gentle but firm. Our eyes met again, and in that brief, suspended moment, the air crackled with an unspoken intensity. My breath hitched. He didn't pull away immediately, his thumb subtly stroking the pulse point on my wrist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was a deliberate, intimate gesture, a claiming. That night, alone in my apartment, the silence that usually soothed me felt heavy, charged with his absence. His presence had filled a void I hadn't even known existed, and now, without him, the emptiness was acute. I replayed every word, every glance, every subtle movement. I could still feel the phantom warmth of his touch on my wrist. It was intoxicating, this new landscape of feeling he had opened within me. I was falling, fast and without resistance, into the vortex of him. But even then, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor of fear began to ripple beneath the surface of my euphoria. He was so intense, so captivating, so utterly there when he was with me. Yet there was always a part of him that felt just out of reach, a subtle withdrawal, a guardedness in the depths of those remarkable eyes that I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't a flaw, not then, but a mystery, another layer that drew me in deeper. I told myself it was simply his artistic temperament, his profound nature, but a small, wary part of me, the part that had learned to protect itself from the unpredictable currents of life, wondered if it was something more, a hint of a past pain perhaps, or a future one. Our first real date was at a small, dimly lit jazz club. The music was soulful, melancholic, a perfect soundtrack to the burgeoning intensity between us. We sat close, our knees occasionally brushing under the table, sending shivers down my spine. He spoke of his travels, of the faces he'd captured, the stories etched in their eyes. I found myself mesmerized,
not just by his words, but by the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his lips curved when he smiled, the glint of amusement, or sometimes a deeper, almost haunted look that would flicker in his eyes before he quickly masked it. I asked him about his family, about his past. He became quieter then, his gaze distant. Complicated, he simply said, his voice softer, almost a murmur. A long story for another time. He offered a small, apologetic smile, but the door was clearly closed. I respected it, even as a pang of curiosity, mingled with a nascent fear of the unknown, stirred within me. It was the first time I felt that subtle barrier, a wall I couldn't yet see but knew was there. Yet, despite that fleeting shadow, the connection felt undeniable, a force of nature. With Reese, I felt truly alive, my senses heightened, my world infused with a vibrant new color. He saw the world with the same intensity I did, noticed the minute details, appreciated the quiet beauty that others often overlooked. We spoke of dreams and fears, of the kind of love that could mend broken things, the kind that was absolute. He made me believe in it, made me believe it was possible with him. I felt myself blossoming under his unwavering attention, shedding layers of protective self-doubt. "I feel like I've known you forever," I whispered one evening after he'd walked me home, standing on my doorstep under the soft glow of the street lamp. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke. He reached out, his hand gently cupping my cheek. His touch was warm, possessive, sending a rush of heat through me. "Maybe we have, Alara," he said, his voice a low rumble, his thumb stroking my skin. His eyes were dark, fathomless pools, reflecting the street lamp's halo. Maybe we were always meant to find our way back to each other. And in that moment, looking into his eyes, feeling the raw, tender intimacy of his touch, I truly believed it. I believed in the magic, in the undeniable pull, in the destiny that had brought us together. The fear was a distant whisper, easily drowned out by the symphony of my heart, singing his name. I leaned into his touch, my body aching for closer proximity, for the complete immersion into his world. He lowered his head, his lips brushing mine, tentative at first, then deepening, a slow, consuming kiss that tasted of longing and promise. It was everything I had ever dreamed of, and in that dizzying rush, I was willing to sacrifice everything, including my carefully guarded peace, for this magnificent, terrifying love that was just beginning to ache. I had no idea then, no inkling of how deeply that ache would eventually cut. I only knew I was falling, utterly and completely, into him.
Reese was everywhere, in every thought, every quiet moment. My apartment, once a fortress of solitude, now felt acutely empty without him. His presence filled spaces I hadn't realized were hollow, and his absence left echoes that resonated deep within me. We spent countless hours together, exploring the city or simply existing in comfortable silence. He'd often bring his camera, capturing the way the light fell on an old brick building or the fleeting expression on a stranger's face. I watched him, mesmerized by his intensity, by the way his brow furrowed in concentration, by the silent conversation he seemed to have with the lens. He saw beauty in the mundane, poetry in the urban grit, and he taught me to see it too, through his eyes. He'd occasionally turn the lens on me, and I'd feel that familiar rush of vulnerability and exhilaration, knowing that he was capturing a part of me, holding it, cherishing it. Our conversations deepened, weaving intricate tapestries of shared thoughts and dreams. We spoke of art and philosophy, of human nature and the universe, of the kind of love that transcends time. He quoted poets I adored, and sometimes he'd read snippets of his own thoughts, raw and profound, from a worn leather journal he carried.
It was in those moments when he allowed me a glimpse into his creative soul that I felt closest to him, utterly connected, as if our spirits were breathing the same air. He saw past the surface, past my quiet demeanor, to the churning currents beneath, and I, in turn, felt I understood the complex, beautiful landscape of his mind. Physical intimacy with Rhys was like stepping into a dream. His touch was a language all its own, tender, searching, yet undeniably passionate. There was a reverence in his caresses, a profound knowing that spoke volumes without a single word. Our bodies seemed to fit together as if sculpted for one another, and in his arms I felt a completeness, a belonging that was both exquisite and terrifying. When we were wrapped in each other, the world outside faded, and there was only the two of us, a perfect, self-contained universe. It was a refuge, an escape from the anxieties that sometimes gnawed at me, a place where I felt utterly safe, utterly loved. He made me feel beautiful, desired, seen in a way no one ever had before. His gaze, those fathomless blue eyes, would linger on my face, tracing my features as if memorizing every curve, every shadow.
"You are incandescent, Ilara," he'd whisper, his voice a low thrum against my skin, and I would believe him. In those moments, all my insecurities dissolved, replaced by a radiant confidence I'd never known. This was love, I thought. This was everything. Yet, even amidst the euphoria, the delicate threads of unease, first spun that initial day in the bookstore, began to tighten. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of wind through a cracked window. He was a man of intense moods, capable of profound joy and deep, brooding silences. When he was present, he was all present, his attention a focused beam. But there were times, often unexpected, when a veil would drop and he would retreat, his eyes becoming distant, shadowed. He would stare out a window or into a book, and I would feel a sudden, jarring separation, as if he had mentally stepped into another room, leaving me alone in our shared space. I remember one evening, curled together on the sofa, the rain drumming softly against the glass. I was recounting a childhood memory, a silly, light-hearted story about my first pet. I looked up, expecting his usual warm smile, the shared laugh. Instead, his gaze was fixed on some unseen point across the room, his expression unreadable, a deep furrow between his brows. His hand, which had been gently stroking my hair, stilled. "Rhys," I murmured, my voice tentative. He blinked then, as if startled awake, and his eyes, when they met mine, were clouded with something I couldn't quite decipher. Regret? Sorrow? He offered a faint, almost forced smile. "Sorry, love. Just lost in thought." He didn't elaborate. He just resumed stroking my hair, but the warmth of the moment had been subtly, irrevocably fractured. I didn't press. I never did. Not then. The fear of disturbing his fragile peace, of pushing him further away, was a potent deterrent. My desire to keep the peace, to keep him close, outweighed my need for answers. His past remained an opaque curtain. He spoke of his childhood in broad, vague strokes, a transient existence, a difficult family. When I tried to delve deeper, to offer an open door for him to share, he would deflect, skillfully changing the subject or retreating into a quiet, unapproachable space. "It's not a story for happy evenings, Ilara," he'd say, his voice gentle but firm, closing the door. And I would let it close. I told myself it was fine, that we all had our secrets, our old wounds. I convinced myself that his reluctance was a sign of his deep sensitivity, his need to protect me from his own pain.
but a tiny, insistent voice in my head whispered, "What is he hiding?" This silence, this deliberate omission, began to fester. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic conflict, but a slow, insidious erosion. It was the moments when words were almost spoken, but never said. The unspoken questions that hung in the air between us, heavy and unaddressed. I found myself editing my own stories, avoiding anything that might touch upon a sensitive nerve, anything that might prompt a revelation he wasn't ready to give. Our communication, so vibrant and open in some areas, developed silent chasms in others. The desire to be loved, truly, completely, became intertwined with a growing fear of abandonment. If I didn't understand his past, if I couldn't access that part of him, how could I ever truly possess his whole heart? Or, more terrifyingly, if I did somehow stumble upon a hidden truth, would it shatter the beautiful edifice we were building? I started to walk on eggshells around certain topics, hyper-aware of his shifting moods, of the subtle nuances in his expressions. My own emotional equilibrium became tethered to his, rising and falling with his elusive presence. I remember another instance, after a particularly wonderful day spent wandering through an antique market, laughing, holding hands. We were back at my apartment, cooking dinner, the kitchen filled with the aroma of spices and the gentle hum of our conversation. I was feeling expansive, loved, brave. "Reese," I began, turning to face him, a smile on my lips. "There are times when you seem so far away, even when you're right next to me. Is there something you want to talk about? Something I can do?" I tried to keep my voice light, reassuring, but my heart was pounding. He stopped chopping vegetables, his knife resting on the cutting board. He turned slowly, his gaze heavy. "Alara," he said, his voice softer than usual. "My past, it's not something I can easily unpack. It's messy, and it's not fair to burden you with it." He paused, then took a step closer, cupping my face in his hands, his thumb stroking my cheeks. "Just know that I love you. That's all that matters, isn't it? What we have now." His words, intended to reassure, only deepened the ache. "Just know that I love you." It felt like a diversion, a beautiful, heartfelt diversion that simultaneously pushed me away while pulling me closer. His touch, his eyes, pleaded with me to let it go, to trust in his love as it was, incomplete. And because I loved him so fiercely, because I craved the refuge of his affection, I let it go. I nodded, leaning into his touch, allowing his kiss to silence the questions, to quiet the insistent whispers of doubt. I wanted so desperately to believe that his love alone was enough to bridge the unsaid. But the seed had been planted. Each time he retreated, each time a question went unasked or unanswered, it became a tiny, invisible wound. My longing for complete transparency, for true intimacy where nothing was withheld, clashed with his profound guardedness. Our love, which began as a magnificent unifying force, was slowly becoming a crucible for my own fear and his unresolved pain. I was walking a tightrope, balancing my fierce devotion against the growing understanding that he might never fully reveal himself, that a part of him would always remain just beyond my reach. The passion was still there, the undeniable chemistry, the moments of pure, unadulterated joy when we felt like two halves of a whole. He could still make my heart soar with a single glance, a whispered word. But beneath the surface, a new pattern was emerging. I would reach out, emotionally, try to connect on a deeper, more vulnerable level, about us, about him, and he would either subtly deflect or more painfully, withdraw. The silence would settle, heavy and pregnant between us, and I, in my desperate need to preserve what we had, would fill that silence with my own assumptions, my own quiet anxieties, rather than confront the discomfort of his evasion. I was beginning to understand that love with Reese was a complex equation. It was a sunlit meadow and a moonlit forest, a warm embrace and a chilling mystery. It was a constant negotiation between the immense joy he brought into my life and the subtle, lingering pain of the unspoken. I knew deep down that this wasn't sustainable, that these silent spaces would eventually widen, but I was so irrevocably entangled, so deeply in love, that I couldn't imagine a life without him. The thought alone was a quiet devastation. I would fight for this, I told myself. Fight to understand, to break through his walls, even if it meant risking my own heart in the process.
The inevitable pull, it seemed, was also the inevitable struggle. The honeymoon phase, if we ever truly had one, faded not with a dramatic crash, but with the quiet, persistent trip of a leaky faucet. It was an erosion, silent and insidious, wearing away at the edges of the beautiful world we had built. The initial thrill of discovery, the intoxicating rush of shared understanding, slowly began to be overshadowed by the growing weight of what was unsaid, what was withheld. My heart, once soaring, now felt like a bird trapped in a cage, beating frantically against invisible bars. The silences, once a comfortable space for two souls to simply be, transformed into vast, echoing chasms. They became battlegrounds for unspoken anxieties, for questions that screamed in my mind but never found voice. I'd watch Reese, absorbed in his photography or lost in a book, and that familiar veil would descend. His eyes, those captivating blue depths, would become distant, opaque, as if he were seeing something I couldn't, residing in a world I wasn't privy to. And in those moments, the profound connection I felt, the sense of being his other half, would fray, leaving me cold and utterly alone. I remember one particularly poignant evening. We were at his apartment, a space that had once felt so intimately ours, now tinged with a delicate unease. We just returned from a dinner with a few of his artist friends, vibrant, boisterous people who had captivated him with their stories and debates. I'd felt a subtle shift that night, a feeling that I was on the periphery of his world, not at its center. He laughed freely, debated passionately, but his hand hadn't found mine under the table as often. His gaze hadn't sought me out with the same silent intensity. Later, as we prepared for bed, the quiet in the apartment felt heavier than usual. I wanted to talk about it, about the subtle distance I'd felt, about the faint ache in my chest. I wanted to tell him that his silence was hurting me, that his retreats made me feel abandoned. I stood by the window, watching the city lights blur, rehearsing the words in my head. "Reese," I began, my voice barely a whisper, Are you happy?" He paused, halfway through pulling on a t-shirt, his back to me. The silence stretched, long and uncomfortable. My heart hammered against my ribs. Please, just say something, anything. When he finally turned, his expression was guarded, that familiar shadow in his eyes. He didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he walked over to me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and buried his face in my hair. "Of course I am, Alara," he murmured, his voice muffled. "You know I am." He kissed the top of my head, a gentle, reassuring gesture, but it felt hollow. It was a deflection, a silencing of the unspoken question that truly mattered. Are you happy with me? Are you still here, truly? I longed to pull away, to force him to look me in the eye, to truly answer, but the fear of pushing him away, of shattering the fragile peace, paralyzed me. I simply leaned into his embrace, pretending his words had been enough, letting the question die on my lips. My desire to be loved, to anchor myself in his affection, became a source of constant negotiation with my own boundaries. I found myself making excuses for his withdrawals, rationalizing his guardedness. He's an artist, deep and sensitive. He needs his space. His past was difficult. He's protecting himself, protecting me. These thoughts became a mantra, a shield against the creeping suspicion that maybe, just maybe, his silences weren't about protecting me, but about keeping me at a distance. The small, everyday misunderstandings, once easily resolved with a laugh or a simple clarification, now grew into significant emotional roadblocks. Because Reese rarely communicated his internal world, I became an expert at reading his nonverbal cues, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the flicker in his eyes, the way he'd subtly shift his weight. But these were often incomplete stories, leaving me to fill in the blanks with my own anxieties. One afternoon, I'd suggested we spend a weekend away, a spontaneous trip to the coast I'd been dreaming of. His response was a non-committal hum, followed by a sudden immersion in his camera equipment. "Maybe," he'd said without looking up. "I'm not sure about that weekend, Alara. I might have something." Something. The word hung in the air, an opaque curtain. Was it work? Was it a prior engagement he'd forgotten to tell me about? Or was it simply a polite refusal, a sign he didn't want to go with me? My mind raced, constructing scenarios, each more painful than the last. I could have asked, "What is it you might have?" But I didn't. The fear of his vague, dismissive answer, or worse, his retreat into silence, stopped me. So I simply nodded, the lightness in my heart replaced by a heavy disappointment. Later, I saw him sketching in his journal, a look of intense focus on his face. I convinced myself he must be working on a new project, something important, and I shouldn't bother him. But the unspoken no to our trip, the lack of explanation, left a bitter taste. The lack of direct communication began to manifest in physical ways. My sleep became restless, haunted by fragmented dreams. My appetite waned. I felt a constant knot in my stomach, a low hum of anxiety that permeated my every waking moment. The joy he brought was still potent, but it was now laced with an underlying sorrow, a persistent fear that it could all unravel at any moment. I walked on eggshells, desperate to maintain the fragile peace, sacrificing my own needs for the illusion of stability. I yearned for the kind of emotional intimacy where both partners felt safe enough to lay bare their fears, their pasts, their vulnerabilities. I offered him mine, piece by piece, hoping he would reciprocate. I told him about my own insecurities, my childhood anxieties, the quiet hurts that shaped me. He listened, sometimes, with that intense, focused gaze that made me feel so utterly cherished. He'd hold me close, kiss my forehead, and whisper reassuring words. But he never opened his own vault. It was a one-way street, my heart laid bare, his remaining a beautiful, impenetrable fortress. Our arguments, when they rarely surfaced, were not explosions of shouting, but rather quiet, agonizing stalemates. One evening, after a particularly long silence following another one of his unexplained withdrawals, I finally found the courage to speak. "Reese," I said, my voice trembling, "I feel like I don't know you sometimes. There are parts of you that you just keep hidden, and it makes me feel like I'm not truly in this with you." He turned from the window, his shoulders hunched. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry,
just tired. Alara, he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. I've told you, my past is complicated. There are things I don't talk about. It has nothing to do with you, with us. It's just me. He paused, his gaze meeting mine, and I saw a flash of pain, of genuine sorrow in his eyes. Please, he whispered, don't ask me to be someone I'm not. Don't ask me to relive things I've spent years trying to forget. His plea, so raw and vulnerable, disarmed me completely. The desire to comfort him, to alleviate his pain, instantly eclipsed my own hurt.
I walked to him, wrapping my arms around his waist, burying my face against his chest. Okay, I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. Okay, I understand. I'm sorry. But I didn't understand. Not really. I understood his pain, yes, but not his inability to share it with me, the person who loved him most. And in that moment, in my desperate need to soothe him, to keep him from retreating further, I inadvertently reinforced the very pattern that was slowly suffocating our relationship. I gave him permission to keep his secrets, to maintain his distance, to leave me in the dark. The fear of abandonment intensified. Each time he retreated, each time a crucial conversation was sidestepped, I saw a terrifying glimpse of a future without him. I loved him with an intensity that bordered on desperation, an all-consuming fire that now threatened to burn me from the inside out. My days were spent trying to decipher him, my nights trying to mend the invisible fractures that appeared between us. I became a curator of his moods, a silent observer, perpetually on edge, waiting for the next shadow to fall. Even our physical intimacy, which had once been a source of pure, unadulterated connection, began to feel different. It was still passionate, still breathtaking, but beneath the surface, a new layer had settled. For me, it became a desperate clinging, a frantic attempt to bridge the emotional distance through physical proximity. For Reese, I suspected, it was sometimes a temporary refuge, a way to escape the complexities of his own mind, or perhaps a way to assure me of his love without having to speak the difficult truths. His touch, once a language of profound knowing, now sometimes felt like a balm, a temporary silence to deeper aches, rather than a true communion. The internal monologue became my constant companion, a ceaseless debate between the intoxicating love I felt and the agonizing pain it brought. Why can't he just tell me? What am I doing wrong? Is my love not enough? I knew intellectually that this path was unsustainable. I knew that a relationship built on such profound silences and unaddressed pain could not thrive. But the thought of walking away, of severing the ties to this man who had irrevocably altered my world, was an unbearable agony. So I stayed, clinging to the fragments of the man I loved, hoping, praying that somehow my love would be enough to break through his walls. The slow, emotional collapse was well underway, and I was helpless to stop it, caught in the inevitable pull of a love that was both my greatest joy and my deepest sorrow. The cracks in our foundation, once hairline fractures, began to deepen, spiderwebbing across the beautiful, fragile edifice of our love. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing process of disintegration, each day bringing a new, quiet erosion. The emotional conflict, once a subtle undercurrent, became the dominant theme of our lives. My internal world was a constant battleground between the enduring, fierce love I felt for Reese and the relentless pain his guardedness inflicted. I remember one particular afternoon, a crisp autumn day that mirrored the fragility of our relationship. We were at a park, the leaves a riot of fiery colors, the air smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. He was taking photos, his focus absolute, his camera a barrier between us. I watched him, a familiar ache blooming in my chest. I wanted to reach out, to link my arm in his, to feel connected. But he felt miles away, even though he was only a few feet from me. I finally gathered my courage. "Reese," I said softly, walking up beside him. "It's beautiful, isn't it? The way the light catches the crimson leaves." He lowered his camera, his gaze still distant, fixed on something beyond me. He murmured, a non-committal sound. He didn't turn to look at me. He just raised his camera again, refocusing. My heart sank. I stood there for a beat, feeling the chill of the air, the chill of his emotional distance. The words were almost spoken, a desperate plea. "Why are you so far away? Don't you see me? Don't you feel me here beside you?" But they remained trapped, a bitter taste in my mouth. I just nodded, a silent surrender, and walked away to a nearby bench, leaving him to his solitary pursuit. The irony wasn't lost on me. He, the photographer, so adept at capturing fleeting moments, yet so incapable of holding on to the present moment with me, of truly seeing and acknowledging my presence, my pain. His unresolved pain became a third entity in our relationship, a silent, pervasive presence that dictated our interactions. It was like a ghost, haunting our every shared moment, its shadow falling even on our most intimate embraces. I yearned to heal him, to absorb his sorrow, to be the safe harbor he so clearly needed. But how could I heal a wound I wasn't allowed to see, a pain he wouldn't name? My attempts to offer solace were met with that impenetrable wall, leaving me feeling helpless, frustrated, and ultimately rejected. The desire to be loved, once a beacon, had become a desperate, clawing need. I was so afraid of losing him, so terrified of the emptiness his absence would leave, that I accepted less and less, convinced myself that even these fractured moments of connection were enough. I clung to the memories of the beginning, the intoxicating rush, the shared laughter, the profound understanding. I believed with a fervent hope that bordered on delusion that the Reese I first met, the man who saw into my soul, was still there, just buried under layers of pain I could eventually reach. But the fear of abandonment wasn't just about him leaving me. It was about him leaving us, leaving the beautiful potential we once had, leaving the vibrant, confident woman I had been in the early days of our love. I was slowly losing myself in the process of trying to hold on to him. My own voice, once clear and strong, had become a whisper, constantly seeking his approval, his elusive gaze. One night, after another one of his unexplained silences, I was making tea, my hands shaking slightly. He was in the living room, listening to a melancholic jazz piece, the kind we used to share, now feeling like a soundtrack to my quiet devastation. I walked in, carrying his mug, and sat on the floor beside his armchair, unable to meet his eyes. "Reese," I began, my voice barely audible, "I feel like we're drifting, like there's this immense space growing between us, and I don't know how to cross it anymore." He didn't respond immediately. The music swelled, then softened. He finally shifted, turning his head to look at me, his eyes shadowed in the dim light. "Alara," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, "I don't know what you want me to say. I'm here, aren't I?" "I'm here, aren't I?"
The words cut me deeper than any argument, any raised voice. It was the ultimate dismissal, a stark reminder that his physical presence didn't equate to emotional engagement. It was a statement that perfectly encapsulated the core of our conflict. For him, presence was enough. For me, it was a hollow shell with connection. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and stinging. "Being here physically isn't enough, Reese," I whispered, the words finally breaking free. "Not when you're 1,000 miles away inside. I need you. I need us to talk, to truly see each other." He sighed, a heavy, weary sound that made my heart clench. He reached out, his hand gently touching my hair, a familiar, comforting gesture that now felt like a desperate plea for me to retreat. "You always want more, Alara," he murmured, his voice laced with a subtle resentment. "Why can't you just accept what we have, what I can give?" His words, meant perhaps as a gentle chiding, felt like a condemnation. "You always want more." The unspoken implication was clear. "You're asking too much. You're too needy."
You're the problem. My breath hitched. The desire to scream, to lash out, to finally shatter this unbearable silence was overwhelming. But the habit of placating, of avoiding conflict, was too deeply ingrained. I closed my eyes, a single tear escaping, tracing a path down my cheek. I pulled away from his touch, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, but one that felt like a seismic shift within me. That night, we slept side by side, yet the emotional chasm between us felt wider than ever before. He fell asleep quickly, his breathing even. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, the full weight of our reality crashing down on me. The love was still there, a fierce, burning ember, but it was now overshadowed by a profound sense of loneliness. This wasn't a refuge anymore. It was a source of suffering. My heart ached with a pain so deep it felt physical, a constant, dull throb that permeated my very being. I saw the slow emotional collapse not just in our interactions, but in myself. The vibrant, hopeful woman who had walked into the written word and met Reese's gaze was fading, replaced by someone perpetually anxious, walking on eggshells, her light dimmed by the constant need to navigate his enigmatic world. The belief that my love could fix everything, could break through his walls, was slowly eroding, replaced by the chilling realization that some walls are too high, too thick, too deeply built. We were caught in a painful circular dance, where love became both the reason to stay and the reason for the suffering. And I knew with a quiet, devastating certainty that something had to give. The unraveling was no longer a threat. It was our current reality. Part 5. The ache had become a constant companion, a dull, throbbing presence in my chest that no amount of distraction or superficial joy could fully quell. It was the ache of a love so profound it felt like a part of my own being, intertwined with the ache of a longing that would never be satisfied, a wound that would never be healed. The slow emotional collapse had progressed to a point where I barely recognized myself in the mirror. My eyes, once bright with the nascent hope of our early days, now held a weary resignation, shadowed by sleepless nights and unwept tears. The fragile peace I had desperately tried to maintain had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The silences between us were no longer just empty. They were suffocating, filled with the ghosts of unspoken words, of dreams that would never materialize. I felt like I was drowning, perpetually gasping for air, while Reese, my anchor, remained just out of reach, adrift in his own enigmatic ocean. There was a particular evening, etched into my memory with the searing clarity of a fresh wound, when the truth of our predicament became undeniable. We were sitting across from each other at our favorite small Italian restaurant, the candlelight flickering, casting dancing shadows on his face. He looked beautiful, as always, his dark hair falling over his eyes, his profile etched with an artistic intensity that still stole my breath. But the connection, that vibrant, invisible current that had first drawn me to him, felt frayed, almost severed. He was talking about a new photography project, an exhibition focusing on urban decay and renewal. His words were passionate, his eyes alight with inspiration. He spoke of texture, of light, of the stories hidden within crumbling walls. I listened, nodding, trying to conjure the enthusiasm I once felt for his art, for his world. But all I could feel was the bitter irony. He could see the beauty and the brokenness in everything around him, yet he remained blind to the erosion happening within us. When he finished, a beat of silence stretched. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a profound sense of exhaustion. The desire to bridge the gap was still there, a faint flicker, but the strength to even try felt utterly depleted. "Reese," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what about us? What about the things that are crumbling between us?" He paused, his smile fading, replaced by that familiar, guarded expression. He picked up his wine glass, swirling the liquid slowly. "Alara," he began, his voice flat, "we've talked about this. I love you. Isn't that enough?" Isn't that enough? The words echoed in my mind, a cruel torment. No, it wasn't. It never had been. Love for me was not just a feeling. It was an act, a communion, a shared vulnerability. It was the willingness to expose one's deepest fears and trust that the other would hold them gently. He offered me affection, passion, companionship, yes, but never true intimacy, never the sacred space where his past and his deepest self could meet mine.
"No, Reese," I heard myself say, the words escaping before I could pull them back, laced with a raw honesty that surprised even me. "No, it's not enough. Not when I feel like I'm constantly chasing a ghost, a part of you that you refuse to let me see. Not when I feel like I'm losing myself trying to hold on to a version of you that only exists in my memory of the beginning." His jaw tightened. He placed his glass down with a soft thud. "I don't know what else you want from me, Alara," he said, his voice quiet, but edged with a familiar frustration, a weariness that mirrored my own. "I've told you about my past. It's not a beautiful story. It's pain. Why do you insist on digging it up? To hurt us? To understand us, Reese?" I retorted, my voice rising slightly, startling myself. The desperation was palpable. To understand you. How can we build a future when half of our foundation is hidden in shadows? How can I truly be with you if you're not truly with me? He pushed his plate away, leaning back in his chair, his eyes dark and distant. He didn't speak. He just stared at me, his gaze unreadable, that familiar wall descending. It wasn't an angry silence, but a profound, unyielding one, a silent declaration that the conversation was over. He was retreating, just as he always did, leaving me stranded on the battlefield of my own heart. In that moment, watching him, feeling the immense chasm widen between us, a quiet devastation settled over me. It wasn't the sudden, dramatic breakup I had always feared, but something far more insidious, the slow, painful realization that it was already over. The love was still there, a fierce, burning ember, but the relationship, the us we had tried to forge, had died 1,000 quiet deaths already. The silence had won. I stood up from the table, my legs feeling strangely heavy. He looked up, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even alarm in his eyes. "I can't do this anymore, Reese," I said, my voice calm, almost detached.
as if it belonged to someone else. I can't live like this. I can't keep loving you in the dark. He said nothing, not a word, not a plea, not an explanation, not even an angry outburst, just that profound, echoing silence. It was his ultimate answer, the one he had been giving me all along, without ever uttering it aloud. My heart cracked, not with a sudden sharp break, but with the slow, agonizing sound of something finally giving way after immense pressure.
I walked out of the restaurant, leaving him sitting there amidst the flickering candlelight and the murmur of other conversations. The city outside was a blur of lights and sounds, but inside I felt an almost unbearable quiet. It was the quiet of utter desolation, but also, surprisingly, the quiet of a profound relief. The struggle was over. The tightrope walk had ended. The days and weeks that followed were a testament to the quiet, devastating nature of our separation. There were no dramatic confrontations, no tearful phone calls, just the slow, agonizing process of pulling away, like two tectonic plates grinding apart. We exchanged a few brief, formal texts about returning a few forgotten items, about the practicality of our shared apartment lease. Each message was a tiny shard of glass, cutting deeper. His tone was polite, distant, devoid of the familiar warmth, confirming the emotional distance that had become our reality. He never asked to meet, never fought for me, never tried to bridge the gap. His silence remained his loudest statement. I moved out of our apartment first, taking with me only what was mine, leaving behind the shared memories, the ghost of laughter, the scent of his skin on the pillows. I packed my books, my journals, my quiet dreams, and with each box, a piece of my heart felt like it was being carefully, painfully detached. I thought about him constantly. I saw him everywhere, in the way the light fell on a street corner, in the melancholy strains of a jazz song, in the quiet intensity of strangers' faces. My heart ached with a longing so acute it felt like a phantom limb. I missed his touch, his brilliant mind, the way he made me see the world through a poet's eyes. I missed the potential of what we could have been. But beneath the profound grief, a fragile sense of self-preservation began to stir. With each passing day, I felt a tiny piece of myself return, a glimmer of the woman I was before Reese, before the constant anxiety, before the silent battles. I started writing again, pouring out the torrent of unsaid words, the emotional chaos of our time together, onto the page. It was a painful, cathartic process, a way to excavate the buried truths, to acknowledge the suffering, and to slowly, painstakingly begin to heal. I understood now that love wasn't just about the initial spark, the undeniable chemistry, or even the profound connection of souls. It was also about trust, about vulnerability, about the courage to show up fully, wholly, for another person. Reese, for all his brilliance and passion, could not do that. His unresolved pain, his fear of exposure, had ultimately created a chasm too wide for even the fiercest love to cross. He had loved me. I knew he had, in his own way, within the confines of his guarded heart. But his love had become a source of suffering for us both, a beautiful cage that held me captive, and perhaps held him captive too. The ending of our story remained unresolved in the grand romantic sense. There was no closure, no grand reconciliation, no sudden revelation that explained everything. It was a quiet devastation, a slow, inevitable fade to black. But for me, in the aftermath, there was a quiet, bittersweet resolution. I had loved with every fiber of my being. I had fought for a connection that ultimately couldn't be sustained. And in the process,
I had learned a profound, painful truth about myself and about the nature of love. Now, sitting in my quiet apartment, the city lights bleeding through the window, I still think of him. The ache is still there, sometimes, a dull echo of a love that reshaped my world. But it no longer consumes me. It's a scar, a reminder of a profound journey, a beautiful, heartbreaking chapter. I carry the love, the lessons, and the pain, knowing that some stories don't end with a triumphant crescendo, but with a lingering, poignant melody, a quiet recognition that sometimes loving someone means letting them go, not because the love isn't real, but because it cannot thrive in the silence. And in that quiet acceptance, I find a fragile, hard-won peace.